I was saying, I think a reason for myself not not having enough pride in being Haitian is because I didn't necessarily know my history. My parents never told me about the great things that Haiti did and accomplished in history. So I just kind of like went along just thinking that Haiti was just this poor and dusty country, and because that's the narrative that you receive about Haiti here in this country. So once I started doing my own research, though, I realized that Haiti played a significant role in the world and in history. Once I started reading about the Haitian Revolution and Haiti's path to independence, and other heroes like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Boukman and Makandal and all these guys, then I just started getting intrigued. So the more and more I started to read about it, the more and more pride I started to get in my ancestors. So I wanted to be able to share that with other people somehow. And I think one of the things I came up with was, and I was actually inspired by my own children. I have a 9-year-old and a 3-year-old. So I wanted them to know about this as well, because I didn't know about it when I was that age. So I started telling him stories at night, and he started getting into it. And then I started writing the stories down. And then I started looking for an illustrator. And then I found the illustrator, and then I put the story together. And then I came out with this book. This is actually my second book. My first book was Haiti, the First Black Republic, and it actually did very well. It sold a lot, so this is the sequel, right? If the first one doesn't do well, you don't necessarily come out with a sequel. So this one was one. Makandal has always been my favorite revolutionary in history, just based off of the stories that I've read about him. And this is mid-18th century stuff. So when it comes to like some enslaved Africans, there's not a lot of history that's recorded about them, and a lot of a lot of the stuff that they did is not necessarily written down, but kind of like shared from stories from ancestors. So I actually did find some extensive research on Makandal. So I started getting into it, and I was like, man, this would be a cool story and a cool follow-up to my first book. So I mentioned Makandal a little bit in my first book, and then now my plan is to come out with a different book sort of like this with all the other Haitian revolutionaries. But I want to start with Makandal as being my first one. So, all right, Jada. So we're gonna go back to the first slide. So kind of like to understand the Makandal story, I want you to kind of know what Haiti was going through leading up to Makandal. So what I'm going to do here, that's my first book. That's Haiti, the First Black Republic. Right, so we can go to the next slide. All right, so these are the first inhabitants of the land. They're called Tainos. All right, so they're indigenous to the land. They call the land Ayiti, which stands for Land of Many Mountains. Right, so they would just grow peppers and sweet potatoes, and they dance, they eat, they play, they just do what indigenous people do. Right, so next slide. 1492, December 4th, 1492, Columbus comes onto the island. Right, it's actually the first European settlement. It was actually built on Haiti. Right, so he comes in, he's looking for gold, and he quickly enslaves. He and the conquistadors, they quickly enslaved the Taino population. They robbed the country of all its gold. They changed the name from Haiti to Hispaniola. And they kind of like just set up shop, right? And the Taino population was wiped out. It went from over 1 million inhabitants to less than 25,000 in about 15 years. So they devastated the region, and that's what they do everywhere. So, all right, next slide. So a few hundred years later, about 150 years later, the French start coming to occupy the western side of the island. In fact, they started out as pirates. I don't know if you ever seen stuff like Pirates of the Caribbean and stuff like that. So there were a lot of French and Dutch pirates on the western side of the island. It was kind of like a small island off the west coast of Haiti, where they would rob Spanish ships coming in from South America. Because the Spanish ships were filled with gold, so they had a bunch of French and Dutch pirates that would, rob the ships. And eventually, they took over the western side of Hispaniola, and they had a little battle with Spain for the territory. But in 1697, they split the island with the Treaty of Ryswick, it's called. So the western third was ceded to the French, and they called it Saint-Domingue, and then the Spanish kept the eastern side, which is called Santo Domingo, which is why now today, Dominican Republic and Haiti occupy the same island, but one side is French and one side is Spanish. So it's been like that for a long time, since 1697. All right, next slide. So now the French come onto the island, start building plantations on the island. Under Spanish, they were just mostly going for the gold, and they bought they had a lot of cattle and stuff like that. But the French were the ones that started the real plantation labor and system in Saint-Domingue. So the Spanish had killed off pretty much all of the Tainos, so they needed people to work the plantations. So what did they do? Well, the French were introduced to sugarcane, which was like the new cash crop of the time. So they needed people to work the plantations, so they got involved with the slave trade. And they started importing enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa onto the island. Total people that came to Haiti to Saint-Domingue from Africa, I believe, was about 1.5 million. And it actually became the most profitable colony in the world. A lot of people don't know that. Saint-Domingue, if you think about it, is the size of Rhode Island, but it provided 2/3 of the world's sugar, right? So they were the #1 colony in the world and kind of like the envy of Europe, right? But the slave labor, if you go to the next slide, Jada, but the slave conditions, the conditions of the African folk there were one of the most brutal, right? The sugar plantations were actually one of the most brutal forms of slavery. And of course, with the treatment of the Europeans, it made it a miserable, miserable environment. I mean, I don't have to talk about slavery in detail. You guys all know the effects of it. So it happened for years and years and years. And then finally, the Africans were like, well, not finally, because there were revolts all throughout ever since, they stepped onto the boat. There were slave revolts. But around the 1700s, that's when it started getting real serious on the island. Next slide. So now there is this one particular person that we're going to talk about today, and his name was Makandal, right? I'm going to get into why he's called Makandal and all that, but he was actually a Maroon. The Maroons were the enslaved Africans that were on the plantations, but they fled the plantations into the mountains, and then they couldn't get caught by the Europeans because of the terrain. The slave masters couldn't get up there. So they would just let the Maroon colonies just kind of like be in the mountains. So this one particular guy, though, Makandal, he was able to unite the Maroons into an army. And the army started attacking the plantations. And Makandal, his whole sense was, you know what? We can take over the island. Right? So he was trying to break the mental chains of slavery in the plantation, and the enslaved on the plantation, and the Maroons in the mountains. So he started preaching to everybody, and his journey was actually very, very interesting. So with that, next slide, Jalen, that's when we get into this story, right? So this is when I came out with my second book, and I'm going to tell the story now. Go ahead, Jada. All right, so the Makandal story actually starts off in Congo, Africa. He was the son of a village chief, and he was next in line to lead his people. So he could read, he could write, he could play instruments, he could carve things. I mean, there was nothing that he couldn't do. He is also trained in medicine, knew the effects of hundreds of different plants in the country, and he was just pretty much awesome, right? So next slide. So his village was raided by slave traders, and you guys know what a village raid is. I don't have to go into too much detail. You know, they come into these villages in Africa, and they raid the villages and all that stuff, and they would try to capture as many Africans as possible and transport them over to the coast. And go ahead, Jada. And there would be these huge ships waiting for them, and they would load all the Africans into the ship, and they would start a journey to the new world. Right? So Makandal was always one of the most rebellious, so to say. So whenever they had somebody that kind of like stood out, like a Makandal, they would name that person after the village where they captured them from. So Makandal was, all right, brother. So Makandal was actually from the kingdom of Makanda in Congo. So that's why they named him Makandal. Right, so that's the Middle Passage. So it took about 6 weeks to get from the coast of Africa to Saint Domingue. So now Makandal, now he's in Saint Domingue, the most profitable colony in the world, right, and also the most brutal conditions for enslaved Africans. Well, I won't say the most, but one of the most. But as soon as he gets onto the plantation, he's becoming sort of like well known among the other enslaved Africans, right? And every time they look at him, he's doing something different. You know, that's making him stand out from everyone else. He's carving stuff. He's talking to people about their history. You can go to the next one, Jada. He's also showing off his skills as a medicine man. So people would bring him, like, not only the enslaved Africans, but also the slave masters would come to him when he's sick, and he'll come up with some herbal medicines and heal people. He picked up the French language on the colony very, very quickly, right, which was a tribute to his intelligence. It was said that he would speak French even better than some of the slave masters, some of the French people, because a lot of them were Creoles that were born. Maybe their ancestors were from France, but a lot of the Creoles were born on the colony, so they wouldn't have that refined, you know, French. And they said Makandal was picking up and speaking better than them. So that's when he started getting noticed. Next slide. Now there are many different stories of why Makandal marooned, right? So I had to choose one for the sake of moving the story forward. But there's a lot of debate among Makandal's life because it happened so long ago and nothing was recorded. But he made big enough of an impression on the French so that they write about him frequently in their historical accounts of the Haitian Revolution. In fact, the book that you just showed me, The Black Jacobins, they mentioned Makandal. You know, so one of the stories of why he marooned that I decided to go with was he fell in love with an enslaved African woman in the master's house, right? It was like a house slave, I guess she was. But I guess the master was dealing with her as well or something. So once the slave master found out, sentenced Makandal to death, right, by 50 lashes with a bullwhip. So 50 lashes, nobody was supposed to survive 50 lashes. So once they found out about Makandal, they used it as an opportunity to get rid of a troublemaker. They tied him up, and they were going to go ahead and give him his punishment. Next slide. So once they tied him up, he escaped, right? So he escaped, and he actually ran into the mountains to avoid the plantation and the discipline that they were going to put on him. So another thing about Makandal was that in legend, he was missing a hand, right? So I used the opportunity to show around this time, this is where he lost his hand. However, in history, it's not really, it's kind of debatable, right? So there's a lot of different things like that, and in the beginning of my book, I have an author's note that kind of lets people know, like, he's more like a man, a myth, a legend type of deal in the stories sometimes, but I didn't want to stop, like, those little detailed facts. I didn't want to stop from telling the story, because the overall story of Makandal is very important and needs to be addressed. But there's two ways that they said Makandal lost his hand. One was in a sugar refining accident where his arm got caught in a sugar refining machine. And the other one was, slave masters were chopping, enslaved Africans' limbs off all the time. So even though that's not exactly what happened to him, maybe it just shows the condition of the plantations at the time. So then he ran into the mountains. He's in the mountains marooning, and finds this huge maroon community. And now he joins the maroon community. Yeah. Now once he's up there with the mountains, he quickly becomes a leader of the other maroons in the mountains. Another thing about Makandal was his family. He comes from a Muslim family, right? So he was very well versed in the Islamic faith, but once he got into the colony was a Christian colony, the French. So he was able to kind of like, they said that one of the ways he learned to speak and read French was from the Bible, right? So he kind of had both knowledges of Christianity and Islam, which he used to kind of help with his leadership. And that's kind of like why he's credited with breaking and hence the name of the book, The Black Messiah, but also that's what he used in order to break the mental chains of slavery that was around the island. So over here, I just kind of have an illustration of him riling up the crowd. You see him holding some scarves, right on and it's just to illustrate I read a historical account about Makandal from a guy named Mark Davis, who spent 20 years researching Makandal. And he has a fictional account, like a book, a novel that he wrote about Makandal. And in the novel, he has a scene where Makandal is riling up the crowd, and he has a vase, and he's pulling out these different colored scarves. And the first scarf is the yellow scarf, which is to symbolize the original Tainos that were on the island. Right, and that's the scarf he'll pull out first. And then the second scarf will be the white scarf, which is to pretty much say that that's the current ruling Europeans. And then the last scarf he will pull out will be the black scarf, and he'll tell them that we are going to eventually take over the island. And everybody will go crazy. So I just used that. I don't know if he actually did that, but I just thought it was a cool illustration that we came up with. All right, next slide. Okay, so now he quickly turned the Maroons into an army, right? Not all of them, but the ones that wanted to fight back, they were wreaking havoc all over the plantation colony in Saint-Domingue. So they would go and raid plantations where they would like just go pick fights with the overseers and the slave masters, and they'll try to recruit as many enslaved Africans as possible and turn them into Maroons, and they'll go steal food and clothing and all the other stuff that they needed in the mountains. So and all his raids, he made his name in the raids, because they say like he will go and kill 10 overseers or something like that. So he was legendary for his plantation raids. All right, next slide. And during the raids, they used to raid so much that sometimes he would get caught, right? So they would actually catch him, they'll lock him up, and they'll set to execute him later, and then whenever they go back to where he will be gone, right? So he was an escape artist as well, and nobody knew how he would get away, right? So so that also added to his legend as an escape artist and everything. So now he's starting to become a legend on the island. Next slide. So now he comes up with an idea to really free the whole colony of slavery, right, from the Maroons. So he knew that the Maroons lacked resources, so he wanted to recruit the other folks on the island that had resources. Well, he knew the whites weren't going to help him. So he tried to recruit some of the gens, they call the gens de couleur, of the affranchis. And there are the ones on the island that are, like some of them are mixed race, or some of them are actually just black African, but they weren't enslaved, right? And they found their way out of slavery, and they owned the land. Some of them even owned slaves, and they had money, they had resources, right? Because if a European man had a baby with an enslaved black woman, then that child wouldn't be a slave. Like, they'll just be on the island, and they could get education, and they're still second-class citizens, but they'll be able to own land and build money and make money. So he went to them to start his revolution, but he needed resources, and they told him no. They said, no, it'll never work. You know what I'm saying? We're not, I don't want to say that they were comfortable with their situation, sort of like their middle-class situation, and they didn't want to disrupt stuff on the colony, so they turned them down. Next slide. And there's a lot of correlations between that and today, too. People that don't want to get up out of their comfort zones. So what did Makandal do? Did he give up on his plan? No. He went and he still wanted to fight back, so he started doing what he did best, and that was using the plants of the island. And so what he did, he took up all the plants, and just like how he used to do medicine out of plants, this time he made the plants out of poison. He made poison out of the plants. And he started giving them to his network of enslaved house slaves and people on the plantation, and they would put it in the slave master's food and water, right? And it would cause havoc all over the plantations, and then once they would start getting sick, him and his crew would go down and they would raid again, right? He really wanted to get slavery off of the island by any means necessary. So that caused a havoc, and this happened over a course of 10 years, right? So this wasn't just like a Nat Turner rebellion of like maybe a couple of weeks. This was over a course of 10 years that was happening in Saint-Domingue. So this was a real problem. And Makandal, he actually caused a lot of the enslaved Africans on the plantation, their lives just became even more miserable, because of Makandal, because all the revolts, and the slave masters didn't want him to recruit any more Maroons. So this is what he did, and he started becoming successful with it. All right, next slide, Jim. All right, so he goes back into the mountains and starts organizing for his big fight. All right, next slide, Jim. So they catch one of his accomplices, and her name was Assam, right? And they start torturing. This is what they do whenever there's some type of revolutionary. They find somebody who's close to him, they torture them for information, and then they use that information to set them up, to set up a trap for them. And that's exactly what they did with Makandal. So she told the information, so they catch Makandal. There's a bunch of different stories of how he was caught, but at the end of the day, he, with a revolutionary figure as big as a Makandal, they always want to make a big scene to teach everyone else a lesson, that if you revolt, then this is what's going to happen to you. So they tie him up. This is in Cap-Haïtien, as a matter of fact. In the center of town, they invite everybody. There's thousands of people there. They have, because everyone knew about Makandal, right? Makandal was legendary on the colony. So once they said that, oh man, they got Makandal, they're going to execute him, everybody came. So he's there, and then he's defiant all the way through, the process. And he starts telling the French that he's going to come back as a mosquito in his afterlife and torture them and all types of stuff. So he's like all the way up to the end, right? So next slide. So now what happens? He gets away again, right? So he breaks, I guess they started the fire. The fire starts coming up, and I guess he's struggling, and it breaks his bonds. Right? And then he gets out and he jumps out of the fire. And everybody's like, oh, like Makandal lives, and they're going crazy. So from that point on, there's two endings to the story, I should say. One of the claims, which is the European claim, is that they capture Makandal again and they throw him back into the flames where he perishes, right? And the other claim, and that's the African claim, is that he got away and he got back into the mountains and joined the Maroon colonies again. Now the reason I believe that the African version is because usually when they have a big figure like Makandal and they catch them and they execute them, they usually do something sick like decapitate them and put their heads on a pike in front of town where everybody can see. This is an example, but they didn't do that with Makandal. Right, so that leads me to believe that they didn't have a body in order to do that with them. Because they did that with a lot of other people less influential than Makandal. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. But yeah, and also just to add at the end, when Makandal said that he was going to come back as a mosquito and torture his enemies, it's noted that one of the reasons the Haitian Revolution was successful was because of the widespread of yellow fever. Yellow fever actually killed tens of thousands of Europeans when they tried to take over the colony Saint-Domingue and re-enslave the Africans again. So because they weren't acclimated to the weather, so they started dropping like flies from yellow fever. And the yellow fever was spread by mosquitoes. Right? So Makandal still gets credit, even though the Haitian Revolution was 50 years after Makandal was last seen. I still give Makandal credit for that victory. So that's it. Awesome. All right, awesome. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy. I mean, that's the Makandal story. There's a lot of different stories. If Jada goes, are you able to go to the next? There's the other slides go into my first book. So what I did, I kind of like interceded, like that's Boukman. Boukman was the revolutionary that came 33 years after Makandal. And that's actually the ceremony of Guacayama that started the Haitian Revolution. It was actually a voodoo ceremony. And Boukman was the top voodoo priest on the plantation, along with Cecile Fatima. That's who I got on my sneaker right there. So she was the Mambo, he was the Wunga. And so that's going to be my next book, Boukman. And the next slide is, that's when they burned down the plantations. Next slide, that's Toussaint Louverture. Next slide, that's when they actually eradicated slavery. The French were forced to abolish slavery on the colony because they couldn't control the revolution. So in 1794, the French actually abolished slavery in all of their French colonies, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. And Toussaint took over Saint-Domingue, and he had an army of 50,000, and he also was politically involved and made treaties with the US, made treaties with the British to kind of supersede the French, because he knew the French was coming back together. All right, next slide. So next slide would be Napoleon in 1801 decided to re-invade. Is it frozen? Next slide. Okay, so Napoleon decides to re-invade in 1801 and turn the colony back into slaves, right? So he sends his brother-in-law, Leclerc, to at the head of 20,000 soldiers and 86 warships to go re-invade Saint-Domingue. And he was successful in captured Toussaint, and put him on a ship back to France, where he died in his jail cell. And the war began. All right, next slide. So they went to war. So now Jean-Jacques Dessalines takes up the fight since Toussaint was not there anymore, along with a bunch of other generals, Henri Christophe, Charles Belair, Cafroy Lamont, a whole bunch of guys. And they go back to war with Napoleon, and they start winning the war. And this is the final battle right here. This illustration is actually from a famous painting, and I just had it illustrated. This is the Battle of Vertier, November 18th, 1803, which was the final battle they beat Napoleon's army with. Next slide. And January 1st, 1804, that became, that's when they claimed their independence from France, January 1st, 1804. And they become the second democracy in the West. The United States was the first democracy, and the first black republic, right? And they voted Jean-Jacques Dessalines the first president, and that's kind of like how it started. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that happened after that, but that's the story that we don't get in our educational system, right? So, like I said, I wanted kids like this age to be able to learn the story. And I thought that it would be a visual way of doing it like this would actually have them respect the heroes that came out of Haiti. So that's it.
Thank you.
So I'll be hanging out here. I have books for sale if anybody is interested. They're great gifts for any young people that you want to know about, that you want to share this story with. They don't have a whole lot of books like these. Like when I want to make a book like this because I take my son to the library all the time, and we get books on like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, MLK, and they're all nice, illustrated, hardcover books. And when I took my son to look for stuff about Haiti, there was nothing like that, right? So I decided to make our own, right? So I wanted it. Even though it's very expensive to make this book, you know, I wanted it to be just like those other books, hardcover, nicely illustrated, because I wanted the story not only to share the story, but also capture the kids' imagination as well.